what I wanted to do was to start off with the definition of the new digital world that government are going into. And I was at a session last Wednesday or last Thursday, and we were announcing a big report with the government. And a chap called Matt Hancock, who's the MP in the Cabinet Office and is in charge of cybersecurity, came out with this brilliant quote, "Smart government you can hold in the palm of your hand," which I think is a brilliant definition of the new requirements that the new government agencies are working towards. So smart government in the palm of your hand. Now, of course, for a traditional security guy, he's going to hold his head in his hands and start to scream and yell. Haven't you heard of the Android malware outbreaks that are coming up? All of the reasons why it's going to be difficult in order to get that smart government there. But as I think Mike was saying, it's now about risk. It's about understanding the risk and how you can take that opportunity to drive better services and to drive better security. So those are some of the kind of themes that I want to try and address. So it's how we actually get that services delivered so that you can get smart government there in the palm of your hand. I think it's really interesting, the palm of your hand as well. When I started, as you mentioned, in e-government, that was in what would be called PIP, pre-iPhone years, when we didn't have smartphones, when we didn't have these millennials wandering around with their noses down the whole time. But their expectation will be to use smartphones now as being one of the portals into our services. And that's not just for public sector, that's for all environments. So just to step back, and I'd like just to look at what we see as the major trends driving security. And we have to call it cyber security. As somebody commented the other day, cyber is when you're talking about bad stuff. E is when you're talking about good stuff. So e-government, good. E-learning, good. But it's a cyber attack and it's a cyber criminal. So you don't send cyber mails, do you, to each other? Well, perhaps you do if they're infected, I don't know. But let's look at these three aspects. I think we started off talking about the whole concept of change in technology in terms of IoT, cloud, and all of that activity going on, V2V, which is now becoming increasingly popular as a topic. What does this mean to me from a security point of view? I think identity is going to be one of those factors. How do we identify a device, an item that's coming in? But I think the major driver or major impact that's going to have on us going forward is something called scale. How do we scale up? How do we get that big so we can cope with all the data coming in? And what are going to be the implications when we start to use identities all around us? So you get into your driverless car, how does it know it's you? Will it be through your smartphone? Will it be through your watch? How will it be, and how will we know? And what role does the state have in knowing that you're driving that car? So there's going to be a lot of policy topics which are going to come out. Rather interesting, just an observation on V2V, there was a big talk recently about some trials coming on the UK. They've got two major trials going on. They've got them in Netherlands and Germany. And they're trialing platooning trucks down motorways, down freeways. And the head of the RAC or the A said, no, we can't do this in England. Our roads are too crowded. You want to do it in somewhere like Nevada or Australia. So you guys are going to be the guinea pig, I think, for platooning trucks down your big straight roads. But it's really interesting. We can get huge benefits for society out of that. Fuel reductions, better safety, and so forth. So that big data explosion is going to be how do you address scale? And I might come back to how we're dealing with that. Now the other concept, and I think we've had lots of data about all the attacks going on, so I'm not going to go into that. We all know it's an issue, and if we don't, we're probably in the wrong auditorium. It's a really big issue that we're facing. But what is interesting to me is what I call the asymmetry of resources. So if we go back a few years, the hackers were small guys, we in defense were big guys. Now, because of that marketplace, which I think was referred to earlier, you get combined capability, which means that the attacker is now the big guy in terms of resources, and we're the small guy, because they're bringing together different component pieces. And the classic example for me was, I think at the beginning of last year, one of the French TV stations was taken off the air, which was quite a thing. And the CDJ looked into it in Paris, and they reckon there was 100 people who launched that attack. Now, how many organizations have got 100 people in defense? Is the question you've got to ask. So we've got to start looking at how we allocate resources and how we can make our security more effective. I know certainly in days gone by, in another life, we went to take out a small hacktivist group, and there was just 2 of them in a room above a souk in the Middle East. That's all they were doing. Now, that would be spread globally, as we know. So far more sophisticated, far greater resources. How are we going to automate? How are we going to look at that more intelligently? So this resource asymmetry is going to be a key. How are we going to collaborate more? How are we going to actually work together in order to deliver those services? The old idea, I think, of doing it all ourselves is probably going out the window. And what we're finding in public sector now is a far more open view towards shared services across departments or with third parties, depending on which department you're looking at. So central government tends to want to keep it itself, but instead of doing it all its own way, it's now looking at shared services more and more. Compliance, I think we've talked a lot about that and the changes that are coming on, especially around breach notification, and I know there's white papers out looking at it in Australia. There's a lot of controversy about it. I think Protivity launched a paper about it just a few days ago about when is a breach, and how do you report it and when do you report it. It's going to be a legal minefield. I think the new European directive is going to probably clarify it slightly because that's linked to human rights. You've got a right to privacy. Therefore, if it is breached, your privacy is being breached. Therefore, there's a legal cause. So we need to have clarification in that environment. But it also will drive this privacy by design issue, where we will have to have privacy embedded into everything that we do. And for me, privacy by design just is get your security hygiene done properly. There's one other issue on breaches before we go on to that, on a bit further. I will be coming back to it. One of the key issues with a breach and notification is what do you do when you know you've got a breach? And we find that one of the biggest issues is you go to the senior management of an organization, say there's a breach, and they say you've got to stop it. If you stop it, you let the attackers know, so they will then launch plan B or plan C or plan D. So how do you cope with that in a world where you have to have breach notification? One other issue which is impacting upon us is, in terms of privacy, is this whole area of extra-jurisdictional data holding. And I know that's addressed in privacy legislation here and in other countries. But for our point of view, we have to adopt different strategies because different environments, different cultures will view it in a different way. So when it comes to holding data, we have to have data centers in different parts of the world. If, for example, this was a German audience and I was to mention data privacy, you suddenly just get the hackles rising. There is absolutely no way that they will allow data outside of their jurisdiction because of our friend Snowden, because of the NSA allegations and so forth. Being somewhat flippant, if you're in a UK audience, they'd say, well, that's what we pay the spies to do, so they should be doing that, shouldn't they? So you get a different view from different cultural views. But you also have to invest in region, especially in your security functions. So for example, towards this market, we've invested in our own secure operations center in Sydney so that we can address the jurisdictional issue. So if we just go through a few other things, in terms of government transformation, where does security rank? This was a Deloitte's study that came out in October. So security is probably third, top of the list. And as you'd expect, there's too much to do, too little money being the top, but security becoming a blocker, which reflects a lot of the issues that have been mentioned earlier in terms of it being up the level, the food chain in terms of reporting. So if you look at organizations like the World Economic Forum, it's right at the top there. So it is one of those big issues that you have. Surprisingly, insufficient technical skills drops down quite a little bit, despite the fact that that resource issue, which was mentioned by Tobias early on, is consistent. Wherever I go in the world, whether it's in Japan, whether it's in Kuala Lumpur, whether it's in India, whether it's in the UK, whether it's across Europe or in the States, that's the number one issue for everybody, without doubt. So what about public sector characteristics? I always try to step back and look at this because of my connection with the public sector and because I deal with a lot of financial services people, and they always go on about how difficult compliance is and who they have to deal with because they've got global regulation. So I cut and pasted this in quite deliberately so you couldn't see it. It's actually online, but the point is it's really complex. The ecosystem that you work within is really complex. This is the UK one, but this is all of the different folks that you've got in this ecosystem, from academia, from vendors, from researchers, from the security services, from the police, from different government departments, from centralized cabinet office issues. So you have a massive group of people bringing in their point of view. In addition, you've got this whole concept of multi-party delivery, and I think that the whole concept of the ecosystem was mentioned. So you have all of these dependencies out there. I think one of the other differences that I've seen with public sector is this whole issue of transparency. We've talked about breach notification. Well, actually, governments had to do that for years. And that's been done quite simply by politicians being asked questions in the House, on the floor. Can you tell us, is there an issue? And they've got to answer. So there's always been a greater pressure, a greater need to be transparent, whether the politicians have liked it or not, through that whole process, of that whole democratic process. The other issue as well is that we found that decision-making tends to be a lot slower than in the commercial world, because you have to put out RFPs, you have to have balanced suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. But just come to think of it, if those attackers can move, build, break, and launch an attack in 2 weeks, how on earth can we start to put in defenses if we have a 2-year procurement life cycle? So somewhere along the way, we've got to try and match 2 weeks against 2 years in order to try and get effectively against them. I'm going to come against a concept which hopefully will start to work around that. So we also have this issue of intelligence and how we work with intelligence. This is just a simple functional flow we drew up for a cert that we're developing for a smaller nation, and how that's going to bring together the different pieces of data. But it's really quite complex in how it flows all the way through. And just right down at the bottom is the actual government department, with all of those other different functions actually pushing in and demanding data to and from it. So again, a highly complex intelligence environment. So if we look at privacy, we look at security, we look at the always on. The new buzzword is digital, or buzz phrase is digital resilience. That's the new thing. It used to be cybersecurity, now it's digital resilience, which is how do you actually keep secure and how do you recover and how do you know what's going on? Now, Mike mentioned earlier the whole concept of risk. That's going to be the key driver. These are 7 principles that are driven by risk. I've actually taken them. I would have liked to thought about myself, but I've got to actually own up to this. This came out of a group from the World Economic Forum that produced a book called Beyond Cybersecurity. It was written by some guys from McKinsey, who get another reference today. I think they had quite a few earlier on. And also a guy called Derek O'Halloran, who runs the WEF, World Economic Forum team looking at IT security issues and so forth. And we'll actually be engaging with him in April, looking at IoT across different industry in areas. So this is some of the stuff they worked at. And this is the message that is going out to senior management, to CEOs, to senior people in government. So that's why I wanted to put it up there. So it's about risk and differentiation. I think we've covered those earlier on today. It's about looking at cybersecurity into risk management, having the right governance process, which I think we started to look at in terms of where the roles and where people sit in DPO and so forth. But also looking at how you can test and deploy your defenses in such a way that you can be proactive. So we've got to get away from the reacting to becoming a lot more proactive. So let's look at policy working through that. These are some of the policy changes I'm seeing coming through different governments. First of all, through the supply chain, that's becoming increasingly important. So government is using its position to build out policies which will drive security, which will impact on federated identity, it'll impact on all of the different delivery, it'll deliver that hygiene into security. We're having very specific requirements put out. For example, in Germany, they're focusing in on the energy industry, so they're driving security by policy into that particular vertical, which will then come back and provide them with better security. The UK government have brought out something called the Cyber Essentials Framework. So any supplier has to make sure they comply with an audited set of controls, whether they're a one-person business or, I mean, what, 150,000 people. We've had to comply with that as well and make sure that all our suppliers are working with it. So there's a policy aspect driving security out and ensuring that you get secure services into government, having that all done independently. One of the other areas of growth as well is that of cyber insurance, which is very, very immature, but is now being looked at as being another way of driving security into the ecosystem. You have to have cyber insurance. And to get cyber risk insurance, you're now having to fulfill various standards. This has still got several years to go before it really becomes very effective. But it will drive better security in your suppliers. Better security will drive reduced insurance premium. We've also mentioned the education and training, and here we're connected with various different universities, both in Sydney and I think in Adelaide. We're working with universities in the US and around the world in order to attack that issue of resource. How do we get better resources? My own personal interest is I'm working on, I think, the first cybersecurity MBA that's been launched. So how do we get people who can manage cybersecurity rather than just be technologists? And that's driven out of a UK university. Interestingly, all of these initiatives, and I've come across initiatives being driven in the Middle East, in the Benelux countries, and in the UK as well, and all of them have something in common with this event, is that they're all sponsored by prime ministers, which means that this is really going up the profile if we're getting prime ministerial observation around the issue. So policy is going to be one thing that we need to do so. So go back to that whole issue of driving security, doing the basic hygiene. I think we've already quoted the standard. There's one that came out earlier on. So again, this to me is just basic hygiene. Get your security right from the very beginning because it's a lot cheaper to put it in the front rather than at the back. How do we do this? We go through a very structured approach. Now, we had a structured approach to development, and I was thinking about how do you introduce security through. Whenever we have a new solution, a new issue, we go through this whole series of processes, looking at all of these boxes to see how they're going to impact. Underneath it, there's about another 120 different requirements, and these are management requirements for that whole process of introducing security. So this is surrounded by innovation, and it's surrounded by culture change as well. We mentioned here about the resilient workforce, which is about how you train them and how you get people to understand security. But it's more than that, it's about changing the culture of the organization. If you look at most of the attacks that go on, we've had lots of talk about that. I think anywhere between 70 and 90% of them, depending on which publicity press release you read, are actually caused by simple user error. So that's the main way in, which is an interesting perspective on security, because will we see massive attacks on the Internet of Things and other clever devices? My view is no, because it's just too easy to actually go in the front door anyway. Compromise credentials, blows away encryption, you're in and away. So we still have a great big issue to deal with there. But why is it important as well? To go back to that resourcing issue, we ain't going to be able to get enough people. But if we can train all of our staff to be security frontline professionals, we're going to end up with bigger security teams. So everybody coming in the morning should think security and be a security person. We've seen this happen with all sorts of different activities like driving cars, et cetera, et cetera. So why can't we just change the culture and the environment around security? Make them more aware of security, make them aware of their role, take on the responsibility, and therefore build out what is in effect our security workforce. So in terms of hygiene, let's just take a simple, straightforward, structured approach to what we're doing. So one of the other aspects of on is the response. What happens when something goes wrong? And I think we've all got to the stage now where we've got to expect something to go wrong at some stage. Mike mentioned some figures. Well, I've got my figure as well. But what we've got is this constant risk of something happening. And what we're finding more and more is it's the response which dictates the impact. It's the response which manages the impact that it'll have on the organization, which can be huge, because you just think about it. You get a breach that gets announced. Well, then your help desks now full. Everybody who should be on the telephone answering, ordinary consumer questions about what they should do is now going to be involved just in answering questions about the breach. So it's very, very disruptive. But there's some basic facts that have got to be put into basic steps. Assume you're going to have one, practice the scenarios. And this another one goes back to the resource issue. You aren't going to be able to deal with it by yourself. You're going to have experts that you bring in to support you during that process. What we've done is we've actually reached an agreement with another company called Mandiant in order to deliver those services, because we can't get enough resource ourselves. So it's impacting on our very strategy. So make sure that you're ready. Make sure that you have that regulatory response ready as well. And with breach notification coming in, that's going to be critical. And also take this proactive approach. Don't just wait for a breach to happen. Try and get your attack teams internally looking at how the attack will happen. That's very different from the standard kind of testing that we do nowadays. This was a really good booklet that was produced by the Belgian government. We do a lot of work with some of their governments because they've got a couple. And it actually mapped out a step-by-step approach for every single government department. Really useful guidebook. And that's my number at the top. That's what's supposed to be the number of records that were breached last year. So we're getting bigger numbers. I don't know what the last number will be by the end of today's session, but we're going up. I think Mike came with 190 million. Now I've got 487 million. I didn't count them all myself, so I can't guarantee it's right. So in identity, how are we dealing with this? We've already had this whole issue of how you go through multiple portals, how you bring a consumer's identity into one so they have multiple, they can go through multiple portals, single access point into multiple different sources. We've actually gone through this with a county council, so it's not a major one, so about 2 or 3 million people being impacted, but looking at it, multiple sources for one person coming in. But then the reverse section as well. How do different departments go and look at that data in a controlled, trusted fashion? So how can you look at an individual social welfare, medical, educational track record in order to see how they're faring and how you can help and support them more? What we found was actually just introducing that kind of identity and access management knocked out a whole bunch of stuff that had got in there over the years that was really quite risky in terms of cybersecurity. Where will it go in the future? I think it all depends on whether you've got ID cards, where you've got embedded SIM chips in them that are going to be the thing that you have, the thing you know, your password's the thing you know, the two-factor aspect, the other factor being something you have. Will it actually be the smartphone? We're doing some really interesting work in smart cities in a couple of areas in the Middle East and one of the Crown dependencies, looking at developing a smart city where you can look at traffic, you can look at parking, you can look at traffic fines, you can look at all of these things and create a picture through that single identity. And what will be your identifier? In some environments, for example, in the Middle East, you all have to have an identity card with a chip in it. You try and do that in the UK, you'll have a revolution on your hands. Governments shouldn't know who I am because I know who I am, so why should you know who I am? So that'll never happen. So we're going to have to look at different ways of doing that. Finally, this is the techie bit. This is where I'm supposed to get excited, but I won't. This is about a bit of innovation, and I was thinking about transformation. Many, many years ago, I've only been in security for about 16, 17 years, but prior to that, I spent 3 years at an organization called the BBC, and we did a transformation from analog to digital. We had to migrate absolutely the whole organization. And one of the biggest limitations in doing a transformation, a change like that, is how do you get the technology through in time without hitting walls the whole way? Now, from the security point of view, this is a technology description. You go in there, you go through some stuff, and you come out here. This is all security stuff that you have to do. And a lot of folk are going to say there should be more and there should be less, and the semantic folk will want to put some other things in there. The Huawei people want to put other stuff in. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that you have to put in. And at the moment, we have this on our network, and we flow stuff backwards and forwards. So if we want to change anything, it becomes really difficult to do. And therefore, any change we're putting in a new application, whatever, becomes really hard. How do we actually change that? So we were working with a major global company who had this issue. They've only got about 300,000 people. So we used this as a pilot to prove it. And what we did was we got all of this stuff, and we just transferred it into a cloud environment. We put it into one of our cloud stacks in different areas so they had the jurisdictional issues solved. But they could then switch those different bits of stuff wherever they wanted in no time at all, and they could migrate hundreds of thousands of people a week to a new environment, to a new working environment. Now, we're discussing this with government departments because a shared service with that flexibility will enable transformation. If you're going to be bringing on new services the whole time, how do you get them through that complexity? So we're looking at how you can bring in that form of innovation to enable transformation rather than be a blocker. So just a couple. One of the other things we do is we always start off with an assessment, and we do some benchmarking. We then go and look at the whole capability, and then you know then when you have to map, where you have to map against. So just to summarize, because I'm running out of time, I'm getting glared at now, it's about resilience. It's about government taking the role as leaders through the ecosystem, not just being a follower. It's about getting that end-to-end approach sorted out, putting in security by design as a form of hygiene, and looking at where you can bring factors together to create efficiency. Be prepared for a failure. Look at that privacy issue, and look at privacy impact assessments, which will look at the data, whose it is, why you're holding it, what the remediation will be. And then innovation is going to be absolutely key. So create a methodology for innovation. We have methodologies for innovation. We innovate many, many new products, but we also look at the new startups and see how we can partner with them and bring them in. And then we take them into our environment and we break them. Because we've got such a huge environment, we can break stuff. Here's a couple of meaningless stats. We have about 20 million IP addresses. That's for the techies here. And we protect about 40 million desktops. So anything we put in, we break. So we're looking at them and bringing them in and trying to break them as part of innovation. And finally, you've got to quote, when you're talking about attack and defense and warfare, you've got to quote Churchill at some stage. So it's about change, it's about improvement, it's about innovation and how you manage this transformation going forward. So there's a few thoughts and observations about security and how we're looking at it now. So thank you very much. I hope I haven't overrun by too much.